NTFS permissions. In this nugget, we'll be discussing NTFS permissions. And we'll start off with really a discussion of inheritance briefly, and then we'll cover inheritance in a couple of other places throughout our topics here. Inheritance is simply where the permission set at one level of your folder structure will pass down through other files and folders. We'll also take a look at the description of various permissions. There's quite a few more than what we saw with the share permissions in our last nugget, so we'll get a start with that. And then we'll take a look at the various configuration that you can use for setting your NTFS permissions and how you configure those permissions. We'll also take a look at how to audit. This is pretty important when you want to track what happens with certain files and want to see who accesses it and when and what kind of access they have. And then we also want to take a look at the ownership of files. This is really important as well in terms of things such as disk utilization for quotas, and the ability to set permissions and the like. We'll also take a look at effective permissions, which is what's going to happen if you have multiple memberships and multiple groups, and yet you have different levels of access for all those groups, and it also combines with your share permissions. We'll take a look at what happens if there's a difference between the share permissions and your NTFS permissions. In our last nugget, we talked about a big bank vault, and how the big bank vault, when it's wide open and allows people to walk in and out of it, can be addressed kind of like your share permissions with Windows Server 2003. Then we also took a look at the fact that the safe deposit boxes inside of that vault might be more like NTFS permissions, which are more specific and only allow access to certain users. Well, now that we've got past the main vault door, or the share permissions, let's get into the actual safe deposit boxes, or the NTFS permissions that would be more specific. Now, we can configure more specific NTFS permissions on the data folder, but that might not be necessary provided our share permissions are already suitable. However, I would need to be more specific down through here. For example, remember that the assistants have read access to this entire share, including then all of the subfolders. Well, I wouldn't want some of the assistants to look into the manager's documents and be able to see something that's confidential, or HR, where we might be able to see a list of who's going to get fired, who's going to get hired, who's going to get promoted, all that kind of stuff. So instead, what I might do is to configure the security permissions more specifically. So for example, on HR, where I don't want the assistants to go, for example, I can right-click on that, and this time I'll go to Properties, because the Sharing and Security tab would take me to the Sharing tab here, and that wouldn't give me what I want because I'm not sharing this. I'm just going to go to the NTFS security permissions. And that's what we have. When you click on the Security tab, that means you are using an NTFS volume because it's not available with FAT volumes, and this is always the NTFS permissions. Now, this whole interface that we see here with all the users and or groups that are in this list is called the ACL editor, or the Access Control List editor. Each individual entry would then be called an Access Control Entry, or an ACE. Now also notice on these security permissions that I have the gray checkboxes here for the administrators, for example, that have full control. What does the gray checkbox mean? That means it was inherited from some higher level. In this case, it's going to be inherited from the root of drive D, and that security permissions on drive D pass all the way down through. So for example, on users, they have read and execute, list folder contents, and read. Again, that's gray checkbox, and that will be indicated that they have inherited these from the root of drive D. And if I right-click and choose drive D and go to its properties, you can see that if I go to the security tab here, that indeed administrators do have full control, and my users do have read and execute, list folder, and read permissions here. And these permissions will pass on down through inheritance. So you see there's still some security that we need to tighten down here as well, because the Phoenix assistants, although they may need to access resources within this, maybe there's certain things we don't want them to access. For example, in well, HR here, we got employee salaries. Well, we don't want them seeing that. How about this? Phoenix staff reduction, well, I guess better expand that column a little bit. Okay, Phoenix staff reduction analysis. So we don't want them to see that. So in fact, I've got a member of Phoenix assistants who's logged on right now, and that's Phoenix user 02, and they're able to access this HR folder, and they could even double-click on this employee salaries. Double-click on that and see, ooh, look at that. The CEO makes over $1 million with bonus, 8 weeks of vacation, health insurance. Man, look at that. Managers, look at all. They make out pretty good, too. Man, none of us seem to make out that well. Yeah, in fact, yeah, $6.20 an hour, no bonus, 1 week of vacation, and no health insurance. Ha! Boy, wait till I tell everybody else. But you know what? Here's another situation. You know, they cannot grant other groups access to this folder. So there's no way for them to change the permissions so other people can access it. But what can they do? They can right-click on this and choose copy, and there's no real way to prevent that in terms of permissions. Then they can paste that anywhere they want to. They can paste it on their own desktop. They can paste it on a web page. Put it anywhere they want, you know, on the internet somewhere. So that is still a security concern that we need to deal with. So in order to lock that down, let's go back to the Security tab where you see me right now on the HR folder properties. Now before I get too involved with this, let's first go to what these different kinds of permissions mean. And most of them really pretty well explain themselves, and you could probably pretty well guess what they are. However, let me also point out that these are not the actual permissions. This is not a write permission. It looks like it is, but it's really not. This is really a collection of settings that we'll later on be able to see in the advanced settings, but it's just a collection or a template of settings that collectively this checkbox enables. But in general, the write setting simply means that you can write data. Read simply means you can read the data. In order for me to be able to write the data, however, I first have to be able to read the data, so I normally would have to have at least these two items selected. I'd also have to have list folder contents if I'm browsing through a folder, and that's what we've got selected here. So I would have to be able to list folder contents to be able to find the files within it, and that's what that is. Read and execute is useful for things like applications where I need to be able to run in a little application. And modify is very similar to the change permission for the share permissions, where I can pretty much do whatever I want to with the folders and documents within the folder, within the SharePoint. And the only thing I can't really do is to change permissions or to change ownership, and for that I would need the full control. Now then, it looks like the easy thing to do then would be just to simply go to users here and say, you know what, the Phoenix Assistance Security Group, the people that are in that group, they're also members of domain users. They have to be, really. So if I just deny users here, since domain users is nested inside of this group, well, I just deny, list folder contents, read, and write. Well, you know what's going to happen if I do that? Look at the background real quick where I've got my focus currently on the HR folder. If I click apply, it gives me the warning, so it's going to override everything. Are you sure you want to continue? Yes. Then look what happens. I can't access it either as the administrator. Why? Because I'm also a domain user. I just locked myself out of that folder. That's not going to be any good, and it's, quite frankly, just a little embarrassing. So I'm going to deselect all these items and click apply again and figure out another strategy. And you see it all comes back there now. Now the thing that for me to do here, if I want to explicitly deny permissions to somebody, is I'll just click on add, and I'll go to the Phoenix Assistant Group, and we'll add them in here. And I just want to make sure that they are denied full control. Really, I would only have to go to list folder contents, because if they can't see it, then they can't very well read or write to it or anything like that either. So I could select that item, or in this case, I'll just select all of them by clicking full control, and it automatically fills in the rest for me. Now with this security permission set, everybody else will continue to be able to gain access as usual, including the administrators. However, the Phoenix Assistant Group will be denied access entirely. Now let me also point out that you want to make this the exception to the rule. You don't want to be doing deny all over the place. And in fact, if you find yourself using deny quite a lot for various groups or users on the NTFS or the share permissions, then there are two things that you might consider. Number one, is my group membership appropriate? If I have to make too many exceptions so that someone would otherwise be able to access a folder because they're a member of a group, but I have to make exceptions for too many individual users, then my group membership is probably not right. I might need to restructure my group membership. The other thing to consider there would be, I might not have the right folder structure here underneath this SharePoint. Generally speaking, whoever you're sharing this folder to, you want people to have the same common kind of access and common kinds of privileges for all of the subfolders. And if HR is a glaring exception to the rule and we hardly ever want anyone to gain access to it, but all these other folders are okay, we probably ought to move HR into its own folder, so we would move it out of the data subfolder, folder so it's not a subfolder, and move it right up to D. And that way we could configure separate share permissions for it, separate NTFS security permissions. Now remember also that the security permissions on these folders are all inherited. So for example, on the HR folder, if I go to its properties and I go to security, and I look at this and I say, you know what, this is just really not what we want. These inherited permissions are not suitable for us. What I can do is go to the Advanced tab, because you see with these items checkboxed through inheritance, so you see the grayed out checkbox there, I cannot click on them and select or deselect any permissions there. But I could deselect this item once I go to Advanced, and I could deselect the ability to allow inheritable permissions from parent to propagate to this object in all child objects. That's why we have inheritance, because by default this checkbox is there, as I mentioned earlier. So I could deselect this checkbox, which then brings up another dialog box that asks me if I want to copy the permission entries that are already there or remove all of them entirely. Let's just choose copy for the time being, and you see what that will do is it will copy the permissions exactly the same way that they are, except they will no longer be inherited anymore, and that allows me to then go back here to where these checkboxes used to be kind of grayed out, and now I can manually and explicitly select or deselect various items here. Now also, the reason why I chose copy was because if I want to do that, if most of these permissions here are already pretty much what I want, I just want to make one or two exceptions to the rule. So for example, maybe I only want users to be able to list folder contents and not read and execute. So I would make that one minor change. That would be a good use of the copy item. The other thing I would have done there, if I deselected that item and got that same dialog box, remember that there was a remove option there as well. That would have stripped all of these permissions out, and then I would have to explicitly add individual users and or groups to the access control editor. Now, if that turned out to be a mistake and I wiped out some settings that I meant to keep or something like that, or if this permission settings in this got so complicated that we were having a hard time untangling it and understanding it, and we wanted to go back to kind of a ground zero here, then what I could do is go back up to the data folder, right-click here, and choose properties, and then going to the security tab, going back down to the advanced button down here, I could go to this checkbox, replace permission entries on all child objects with the entries showing here that apply. In other words, any settings that can apply to subfolders. And then we click OK here. You sure you want to do this? It'll remove any explicitly defined permissions. So remember my Phoenix assistants, they're going to get wiped out from the HR security permissions. So I'll go ahead and click yes here and OK. And then sure enough, when I go back down to HR and go to its properties and security, you see that I've re-inherited everything. It's got the gray checkboxes. But my Phoenix assistant, where I had denied all the access, that is now absent, and I would have to go back in and manually add that permission again. Now also a while back I mentioned that all these are really collections of settings. For example, read is not really read, list is not really list, it's really a collection of additional settings, and you can look at those if you click on advanced and then go to a user or group selection here and then click on edit. So for example, administrators have full control, which we see, and we also have these additional permissions that comprise full control, which I'll explain. Traverse folder, for example, means that I can move through one folder to view other folders that contained inside of it and files contained inside of it, and I can execute files as in applications. I can actually just go ahead and run them. List folder means that I can view the contents of the folder and read file names and folder names. Read data means that I can do just that, read the data within a file, for example. And then read attributes allows me to see whether or not it's a read-only attribute or an archive attribute or a hidden attribute and that kind of thing. Certain applications will create extended attributes, which I can read with this item. And this would be an example of, for example, Microsoft Word, which contains information about the author, contains information about what company is involved, who the editor is, all that kind of thing would be extended attributes by a specific application. Create files and write data pretty well explains itself. Create folders explains itself, but append data means that I can take existing data and add additional data to it. Write attributes means that I can write or make changes to the attributes that we were able to read up here. The write extended attributes item allows me to change the attributes that I'm able to read in these extended attributes. And the delete subfolders and files would allow me to do just that, delete the subfolders and files within the subfolders. Also, I can set this single delete item. That would allow me to also delete a file or a folder. However, the difference is this item here, the delete subfolders and files, will allow me to delete even if this delete permission down here has not been granted on a subfolder or file. So this is kind of an overriding capability to delete right here. And we have the read permissions, which does just that, allows you to read. And then the change permission allows you to make changes such as hitting deny on something or adding or removing users and all that kind of thing. In other words, all the administrative stuff that I've been doing for this whole nugget. Then we have the take ownership item here, and that allows you to change who the owner is. And this can really have an effect on things such as quotas. If you have disk quotas on your hard drives, which allow you to have only a certain amount of disk space utilization for each individual user, well, that's usually tracked by ownership, and so that might be handy for this in addition to other things. Now, if I cancel out of this and go to one of the other permissions, you'll see more clearly how, for example, with users, if I double-click on that, that it really read and execute is really a collection of all these different settings. And if you put all these together, you can kind of see how, yeah, I can read all this stuff, I can read all the attributes, yeah, and I can execute files, so sure, read and execute makes perfect sense there. You might also have some that are not exactly obvious. In other words, if I back out here a moment, that doesn't really have a set permission for read and execute like this. If it's somewhere in between, for example, with this user's item, we have what we call special permissions. This means that if I double-click on this, it allows me to create files and write data, create folders and append data, but there's not really a named permission for that on the simple interface that we see out here, so it's just designated as special permissions. Now we can also go to the Auditing tab and determine, by looking at the security event log, exactly who accessed a resource, what time it was, whether they were successful, whether they were unsuccessful, what level of access they were able to gain, and so forth. And we do this simply by going to the Auditing tab and clicking Add. Then we select a user account or a group account. Maybe I want to keep track of every time, Phoenix user 01, if I can type here, Phoenix user 01 accesses a resource in the HR folder. And I want to see any time that user even goes to the folder or attempts to execute a file. And I can list folder, read data. That would pretty much give me all I need if I just want to see every time they touch it. If I want to also see other things, whether or not they've been fiddling around with files, and they've been deleting people's files and folders and all that kind of thing, then I might go down here and see every time they delete something or modify something or make other changes that we don't really want them to write, for example. So I'll just leave it the way it is right now. I just want to see if they ever touch it, and I'll click OK. And then I would click OK here again, and then OK. Now, the next thing I would need to do is to go to my Group Policy Object Editor, and in this case, I'm on the Default Domain Policy, and underneath Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, Audit Policy. From this point, in order to check the file access, I would go to Audit Object Access, because files are objects and folders are. So I would define the policy settings for success and or failure as I desire. Then I'd click OK. Now then, the next thing I would need to do would be to create a policy for this as well. Now, since the file share that I'm looking at is on a domain controller, I'll need to right-click on Domain Controllers here and choose Properties, and then I can go to Group Policy and edit the default domain controller's policy to enable auditing. So there's really two pieces to enabling auditing: the NTFS permissions tab that we just saw and the auditing tab that we just worked with. And then there's also the policy side of this. Now, if this were a standalone file server that we were working with, then I could just go to gpedit.nsc to access the local policies. But given that it's a domain controller, of course, I'm going to go to the default domain controller's policy here and click on Edit. And then over here, we'll go to Windows Settings, Security Settings under Computer Configuration. Then we'll go to Local Policies and Audit Policy. Here we would define object access, and I've already selected it. We would define the policy settings for success and or failure as appropriate. And once that's configured, you would then reboot that domain controller. Now, anticipating that was going to be necessary and trying to save a little bit of time, I already configured that, and I've already rebooted this domain controller, so that now when I'm on client 01 over here, and I access the local file system or access the file system through Windows Explorer or my computer, then I can go to whack whack DC Nugget 1 data. Now I'm traversing the folder HR. Now I'm opening a file on the HR folder, or in the HR folder, and now all I'm going to do is close that back up. Now all I want to do is to go back to my server over here, and I'm going to right-click my computer and choose Manage. From here, I can actually look at the security event log by going to Computer Management, System Tools, Event Viewer, Security, and this will tell me what kind of object access, if any, was gained on that HR folder and any files therein. In this case, if I double-click on this item here, I see that indeed Phoenix User 01 did try to access a file in the HR share. And if I click down a couple here, we see that the file that they tried to access was the employeesalaries.doc. So that could be pretty indicting to find out that this user has been accessing that file, especially, for example, if they were told not to. And if you go further on down, it shows you what kind of access they had. They had read control, they read the data, they read the extended attributes, and they read the attributes. If they had done other things, such as make changes to this, and I would also track that, then it would tell me those kinds of access as well. Now then, moving to the Owner tab on the Security Settings, we can also configure who owns the file. For example, right now, the current owner of the HR folder, since I created it as an administrator, is going to be the administrators group. And that's the default behavior in Windows Server 2003, such that when an administrator creates an item on the server, then the administrators group becomes the owner. If an individual user creates a file on a file share, for example, then it's that individual user who becomes the owner, or the creator owner. Now, if I want to change this to someone else, then I can change the owner to one of these listed accounts. The administrators will always appear there, which is very handy if you want to take over some files that someone has left behind that's left the company or something like that. And I can also specify whoever the currently logged on user is, provided that they have administrative function or provided they have permissions to take ownership of that file or folder. Now, I can also, as the administrator, select other users or groups. And this is new in Windows Server 2003. In the past, we've had to use utilities such as the change ownership executable from a command line, chown.exe or chown.exe. It was kind of cumbersome and difficult to use. It's actually a Unix tool. But here now we can choose other users or groups here. Simply enter in the name of whoever it is we're trying to access. For example, maybe I'll enter in Phoenix, admins. And now we've got Phoenix admins here. I can change the ownership to whoever I select here. So be careful where you've selected on your mouse here. Select the user or group that you want. And then you can replace the owner on all the subcontainers and objects as well. Then I just click apply. And now if I just actually OK out of all of this, then I'll see that once I go back into this and look at the properties of a given document, go to Security, Advanced, and Owner, I see that the owner is now that security group. Now offline here, I've gone ahead and gone to the permissions of this HR folder, and in the Security tab, you see that I've added Phoenix Admins, Phoenix Assistants, and Phoenix HR and Managers to this, and I've given them varying levels of permissions. So Phoenix Admins has full, Assistants have read and execute, HR has read and execute, and Managers have modify permissions. Now, why did I do that? Because I want to illustrate to you something that can happen here, and that is the complications of specific security settings. What if I'm a member of all of these groups? What security permissions do I get? What if I've got an additional setting down here for Phoenix user 08 who's a member of all these groups, and they've got an exception or a deny or something like that? Well, it's the same as what I told you with share permissions, as it is with security permissions, which is also known as NTFS permissions. What happens is we collect all of the various permissions that they have and we add them up cumulatively, and normally it's the most liberal set of permissions that will then apply to whoever the user in question is or the group in question is. Except for if there's a deny selected anywhere, a deny always overrides an allow permission. Now another NTFS note here, however, is that if on this folder, and I don't have an example right now, but if on this folder I have inherited a deny permission that was set further up the hierarchy, if I add a user account here that is was previously denied permission because of their group membership, for example, if I add that user account here and explicitly allow, then an explicit allow will override an inherited deny. Did you get that? Just remember that statement and you'll be okay with it. An explicit allow will override an inherited deny. Okay, so now we've got all this configured, you can see how it kind of gets complicated and everything. Let's go ahead and take a look at the advanced security permissions and look at a very handy new tab here in Windows Server 2003 called the effective permissions. And with this, I simply enter in a group or user name and it tells me exactly what they can access. For example, I've added the Phoenix user 01 account to all of those security groups that we just looked at. So now I'll click on Select, and I want to see exactly what's going to happen with Phoenix user 01. So PHX user 01, and I want to see what permissions this person gets. Well, he gets full control, or she gets full control, and you can see all the permissions that this person gets. Why? Because once again, they're a member of the Phoenix admins group, which had full control. Now then, just to add a little interest to that, I've gone back to the Security tab here where we're going to add Phoenix user 01 again. And this time we're going to go ahead and instead of granting them some kind of access, we're going to remove write access and click Apply. Then we'll go back to Advanced and go back to that effective permissions where I'm going to again select Phoenix user 01. And now we see that they no longer have full control even though they have membership for the Phoenix administrators that would have given them full control because of my explicit permissions. Anything that implies writing anything, they do not have the capability to do. They cannot write data, they cannot add data, they cannot write attributes, write extended attributes. So we're pretty much leaving them with all the remainder here and the ability to look at things. And again, this is very handy in terms of getting to the bottom line, especially if you have a very complicated permission set and users are nested inside of groups that are nested inside of other groups that are nested inside of other groups, and so on and so forth. Now, one thing you also want to keep in mind with the Effective Permissions tab is that it does not take into consideration the shared permissions. So you still have to be mentally aware of what those are. So, for example, if the shared permissions for Phoenix user 01 were explicitly set at read-only access, and that was all they had, then they would not be able to do any additional permissions, even though it might look like they can within this Effective Permissions dialog box, because, again, it does not take into account shared permissions. Now you also want to be clear on what happens when you combine share permissions with NTFS permissions and what the bottom line effective permissions are going to be. You see, if I have share permissions and I'm a member of 3 separate groups, one group has read-only access, the other group I'm a member of has change control, the final group that I'm a member of has full control in its share permissions here. Now remember, we accumulate these, they're cumulative, so our effective permissions there for the share permissions are full control. However, on the NTFS permissions, I have a different set of permissions. I have only list folder and read and execute permissions. And in this case, I again will accumulate the permissions that I have, which the bottom line here would be I have read and execute permissions here because that's the most liberal permissions that I have on the NTFS side. Okay, so on my share permissions, I have full control. But on NTFS, I've got read and execute permissions. So which one is it? Which one do I get? Well, when you combine the separate permissions, NTFS, you wind up with the most liberal. Combine the share permissions, you wind up with the most liberal permissions. But between share and NTFS permissions, the overriding permission is always the most restrictive, which in this case would be read and execute, and that would be my bottom line. That's the most I can do. Here is the read and execute permission only. Now let's take a look at another scenario. On our share permissions, we have full control granted one group, change to another group, and then read access to a third group. And I'm a member of all 3 groups. Therefore, I get, again, the most liberal permission, so I have full control share permissions. However, over on the NTFS side, I have modify as the most permissive permission that I have on NTFS. However, remember that deny always overrides everything. So on full control, if I have any membership as a single user or in group membership that is denied full control will pass down all the way through all of these permissions. Therefore, I'm totally denied access. What's my effective permission between the two? Again, whatever the most restrictive is, denied full access is the most restrictive. Therefore, that's what I would have in this case. And this effectively, along with the effective permissions tab that we saw in our NTFS permissions, this, plus the knowledge of how to combine NTFS plus shared permissions, is pretty much the majority of how to troubleshoot access to any files and shared folders that you'll have. In this nugget, we took a look at NTFS permissions, and we started with the discussion of inheritance, which we also addressed later on throughout other topics. We took a look at the description of the permissions that are available to you. There are several more than are available with just the 3 shared permissions, so we need a little more detail there. And then we also took a look at the configuration of NTFS permissions, how to work with things like inheritance, how to override inheritance, how to add users or to deny users access. And then we took a look at how to audit those resources so that we can see who accessed it, when they accessed it, if they were successful, and what kind of access they had. We also took a look at the ownership of various files and folders. This is important because whoever owns it can change permissions on it, and you want to be sure that you know who has the capability of changing permissions, as well as the fact that sometimes you need to transfer files and folders to another user so that they can access them appropriately. We also took a look at the effective permissions. This is especially important because not only do you have to combine your NTFS permissions, you also have to combine your shared permissions, and then you have to determine which one wins out if there's something like a conflict between your NTFS permissions and your shared permissions. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.